A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. Each episode, we take a work of speculative fiction and we ask writers, scholars, and other readers to talk us through it, what it means, where it comes from, what it points to. Today we are talking about Charles R. Saunders' novel Imaro, and I am delighted to be talking about it with Jon Tattrie. Jon is a writer and journalist from Nova Scotia, the former editor of Atlantic Books Today. He's also a novelist and the author of a number of nonfiction works of history and biography. His latest book, To Leave a Warrior Behind, should come out just the week before this episode drops. So it's hot off the presses, should be on the shelves of your local bookstores. And it is a thoughtful investigation of the life and stories of Charles Saunders, who worked alongside Jon at the Daily News of Halifax. Jon, thanks so much for joining. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm always happy to talk about Charles and to let more people know about Charles. He was an amazing person and an amazing writer, and I feel like he's just getting started as a writer.
Yeah, no, I've had Saunders on my list of people I wanted to talk about eventually on the podcast. And at the Ancillary Review of Books, we're always sort of like looking in the future, like what's coming out, particularly in terms of nonfiction about science fiction. And I saw your biography pop up, and I was like, oh, this is a fantastic chance to talk about this. So yeah, really, really glad this came up. Also, I want to say, as an aside, I have had for a long time in my life a low-key desire to get to Nova Scotia. And reading your book has really made me really lit a fire under it. So I got to get up there. So
excellent. I kind of want people to come out and visit Charles. You know, it's an amazing place. I was out there earlier this week to his grave, and it's a special place. You know, I think there's lots of reasons to come to Nova Scotia, and that's a good one to add to your list.
There is, you might already know this, but there is a new science fiction conference or convention that's starting up called TriCon.
Yeah.
That I think is going to get some speculative readers' eyes on Halifax. So yeah, it's exciting. I hope people take the chance to go out and see the memorial. So,
can I tell you a little bit of the backstory of TriCon?
Yeah, absolutely.
As I've been working on this, we also created the Charles R. Saunders Prize with the Writers Federation of Nova Scotia. And I was having a meeting with them about the prize, and we met at the Trident bookstore in Halifax. It's just a great bookstore, big book lover's place. And as it happens, Charles used to live above the Trident. When he first moved to Halifax, he had an apartment above the Trident. So when I went in there, I just printed out an article that had an interview with him in his apartment in that building, handed it to the owner of the Trident bookstore, and she was literally on her way to a conference of speculative fiction in Ontario, talking about East Coast contributions to it. And she had no idea Charles had lived in the building, had any connection here, but she really embraced him. And she's the one who started the TriCon Festival. And that's why she's put Charles at the center of it, because it's he was upstairs from her bookstore the whole time.
That's wonderful. That's great. Yeah, I gotta see if I can make that. I don't know. I'm really tempted. Friend of the podcast, Amal El-Mohtar, is going to be the guest of honor this year. And yeah, I don't know. People, maybe you'll see me in Halifax. We'll see.
Nice.
But before we dive into this, anything else of note you've been reading or working on you want to talk about?
Yeah, as I say, I've been a recent convert to the podcast, and I love hearing people talk about other things. And so I'll tell you one, since I started writing this book in 2020, I was mainlining fantasy books, like as many as I could, and love audio versions of them. So I read the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, which, if people aren't familiar, he has kind of a trilogy of trilogies. The first one set in sort of medieval kings and queens and monsters times, then one set in kind of the Wild West, and a planned one in a sort of cyberpunk future. And as audiobooks, they were just spectacular. Like, the narrator was amazing, and the imagery that Sanderson comes up with just blew me away. I really liked his magic system too. I'm reading the Harry Potter books, and in there, the magic system is basically wave your magic wand and it seems like anything can happen if you say the right words. But in the Sanderson Mistborn world, it's very specific, almost like a scientific discovery of magic that works in the same way over and over again. And so I love that series, especially as audiobooks.
I'm bracketing off. There's like this huge ongoing, ever ongoing discussion about how mechanistic magic is or should be, and that's definitely one of the poles that people swing around. So,
can I tell you another one I recently read was Jude Meyer, who's another Nova Scotian writer. He has a book I got from HalCon last year. He was selling them there called Patchwork Nova.
Okay.
And he had it was such a fun premise. Like, in Nova Scotia, we have the Shag Harbor alien abduction. That's our most famous alien incident
Okay.
here. He's not directly building on that, but he kind of wondered, what if the aliens came, but instead of abducting a couple of people, they just cut out all of Nova Scotia, lifted it up into space, put it on a huge Dyson platter with a bunch of other chunks of planets, and then jetted off into the galaxy. So that's what happens. We start in space with our space Nova Scotians, and then things go wrong, and they have to fight their way across all these other patches of worlds. And Jude just had his imagination. It must have been so much fun to write, because every world is, sometimes the inhabitants are so tiny that they end up living in one of the characters' ears.
Okay.
Other times are like huge sort of smoky blobs coming across, and it was a lot of fun, and it was just fun to imagine Nova Scotians just being the only surviving humans left in the world in Space Aliens.
I love the idea of rather than like the sort of like atomized individual person taken away, like a whole community, a whole place. Oh, that's cool.
And how they grow, because we start 40 years later, so everyone in the book mostly has grown up, where this is normal, and they're just like, yeah, the old people talk about planet Earth, but whatever, so it's
Oh, that's very fun.
yeah, a lot of fun.
You said Patchwork Nova?
Patchwork Nova, Jude Meyer, yeah. Independent writer, so yeah, you're putting money right in his pocket.
Yeah. Oh, great. That's wonderful. Very cool. But let's leave the future and go to, well, I don't know if it's the past. This is interesting,
Yeah.
right? So today we're discussing Charles R. Saunders' novel Imaro, which is a foundational text of sword and soul fantasy. It's set in a kind of mythic or fantasy version of Eastern Africa. It's a fix-up novel that relates several episodes in the life of its eponymous hero, Imaro. It has an unusually complicated publication history. So it has component stories that were sometimes published separately and individually in various magazines and venues. They have been rearranged, removed, replaced, sometimes significantly edited by Saunders over several decades and publishers. The first novel format was published by Daw in 1981. The one that I am reading today is the Nightshade Books version from, I believe, 2006. So the Imaro books and sort of Saunders' project more broadly is building on but branching away from the tradition of things like Burroughs' Tarzan, things like Robert Howard's Conan. And Saunders' Imaro is a heroic warrior who defeats human and otherworldly foes as he seeks, well, I think we're probably going to talk a bit about what he's seeking. These books are really interesting in having the sort of shape and texture and flavor of a certain kind of pulpy sword and sandal fantasy, but they're doing something a little different. I was really surprised reading through it this time, kind of what was jumping out at me. But we'll talk about that more as we go in. So to start out, Jon, tell me a little bit about your relationship with this book, and for listeners who don't know, tell us a bit about your relationship with Charles.
Yeah, I've got some fun show and tell things here for you if I can grab those. So a little about the book history for you. So as you say, it started. This is here I am doing some great podcast stuff by showing you things. This is so it started in zines, and he's Charles, and you say the pulpy style, like Charles, as he repeatedly said, he never forgot that he was here to show the readers a good time. He never ever let the ideas he wanted to write, which were serious, big, profound ideas, he never wanted that to get in the way of a good dust up, a good fight, a good monster, just fun. So this one here, this is a magazine called Dark Fantasy, which Gene Day, people who are deep into fandom will probably recognize Gene Day. He died a long time ago, but he was a very important illustrator at a time. He published this. Charles took him the first Imaro story and just handed it to him in person in Ontario, published it in this fanzine. And then he actually went to a convention. Charles did a book convention, and the publisher at Daw approached him and said, "Can you turn this into a novel?" So that led to, this is the Daw version here. Mm-hmm. And people, if they look at it online, they'll see Charles, to his chagrin, described this famously as Tarzan with a tan. The black warrior he had spent his whole life building has been bleached white and turned into a European. And there is more, these editions here, I don't know if you saw these ones, but these just came out at the start of this year. This is a new British edition of them that's brought back at least the first two. So there's a fascinating history, but I can tell you about how I...
Well, actually, I'm just going to pause here because I want to describe for people who haven't seen these. I'll try to find links and put them in the notes. But so our first one here is a zine illustrated by Day. It has a black and white very pulpy, extremely muscled picture of a man with an afro holding a sword and a severed head. It's very fun. It's got some like Gothic script in the title of The Return of Imaro. And then in the Daw original, which I am blanking on the artist's name, although I just read it.
Ken Kelly.
Thank you. This is a serrated, sort of a Vallejo, Frazetta-esque kind of figure. But yeah, he's not recognizably black. He's kind of dark-skinned, but it could very easily just be Tarzan. He's fighting some kind of hippo monster coming out there. Also, I want to call out on that Daw version, just because it's fun. That's the Neuland Inline font, which people may know from the Jurassic Park. It's the same font. I just think that's fun.
Do you want me to tell you the monster's name? I just finished reading the audiobook, so I had to... I ended up cursing Charles. I'm like, Charles, why would you make up these words and make me say them, my friend? So this monster here is, let's see if I can do it, Isakuku Madevu.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And everything, as we'll talk about, everything Charles wrote is underpinned with real African history, real African folklore. That was the touchstone of Sword and Soul, the calling card of his work. That's what he wanted to do more than anything else, was forget the Tarzan. You talked about Tarzan, and he read Tarzan as a child and loved Tarzan when Charles was a child. He loved the book set in Africa. He loved this idea that you could set speculative fiction in Africa. It was the first time he'd ever read it. And it was only as an adult that he came to see the racism cooked into so much of it. It really, for me, writing the book, it was really hard to read Tarzan with a child's innocence and enjoyment. It took a lot of work to kind of get to enjoying it. But yeah, Charles wanted to create a hero who could kick Tarzan's ass, basically. And that's where he came up with Imaro.
Yeah, I don't know how many people these days still go back and read the original Tarzan. I'd read it when I was, I don't know, 10 or 12 or 13 or something like that. And then, yeah, I remember reading it again as an adult and just being flabbergasted at the level of racism in it is just astonishing.
Yeah.
Really, really, really blatant in your face. And, in that, it's interesting, reading this and thinking about that heritage of, yeah, there is that. Saunders is still writing. He wants to write like pulp fun stuff. And like Tarzan is really fun. And then just has these really gross sections just dropped into it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Tell me about your relationship specifically with Imaro. Mostly just like timeline-wise. Did you meet Charles before you had read this, or did you read this before you met him?
I am one of the luckiest people in the world when it comes to this, because I first heard of Imaro. So I grew up here in Nova Scotia, in Halifax. And when I was a kid in the 1990s, Charles Saunders was maybe the most famous journalist in Nova Scotia, especially certainly the most famous black journalist. He had a column in the Halifax Daily News long before I worked there. And he was just very well known. He wrote a lot about Africville, the black community that was destroyed here in the 1960s. And he was just a really cool person. He wrote a great boxing book, so I knew who he was. And but I had no idea he wrote fiction. And in 2006, I got a job on the Halifax Daily News as a copy editor on the night shift. And the first shift I went in there, I was like just meeting all of my new colleagues. And then this wizard turns around and looks at me and just says, "Hello." And it was Charles. And I recognized him right away as Charles Saunders from his column. I didn't know he was an editor now. I didn't know I'd be working with him. But about 6, 7, 8 months into my time there, I was trying to get published as a writer. So I did a feature for the paper called Confessions of an Aspiring Novelist, trying to, get my writing into publishers' hands, learn how you crack that code. And one day Charles walked over to me and he handed me the Nightshade edition of Imaro and just said, "Here you go, John, you might like this, And so I read it right away and loved it and got the Quest for Cush and read that too. Charles and I never discussed it as far as I can remember. I had no idea at that time that there was any. I thought these were new books he had just published. And, every journalist has a novel in their trunk drawer, they say. And I thought this was just Charles. I was kind of like, oh, look at that, Charles, you did it. You got your novel published. Great for you. And so it's only been in the reintroduction to Charles, his post-death return to my life, that I really started to reread Imaro and understand what he had been up to, the gift he had been offering me that day. And really the depth behind the pulp fun, and that his amazing ability to have fun, but not sacrifice depth of character.
So let's dive in. Let's talk about this novel a little bit. So I think we're primarily going to be talking about the Nightshade edition version of it. And maybe we should mention that the big difference here is, so Imaro is an ongoing series. I don't know how many component stories, because I believe it's it's around 3.5 books worth of kind of fix-up material, right? And then to some extent 4, and I think definitely 5 were conceived of as like novels from the beginning. Does that sound about right?
Number 3 in the series, 3 and 4 were novels from the start. 1 and 2 are both fix-ups. And with his Dossuye books, which we may get to, the first Dossuye book is a fix-up. The second one is a novel from birth.
Okay, got it. So there's sort of an ongoing series about this one character, Imaro. In republishing them and repackaging them in this 2006 edition, Saunders did a couple things. One of which being taking out in its entirety one of the component stories that he felt was just too close in how it ended to reflecting the Rwandan genocide. Basically, just he wrote it well before that, was drawing on place names and cultures from that area, and just didn't see a way to salvage sort of how the plot of that story wound up lining up with later events. So he pulled that out. He put in 2 other stories, and I want to say he shuffled one of the stories out of the Farce Imaro into the second. And as he was doing it, and as one of the things I was most fascinated about reading To Leave a Warrior Behind was you drilling into the kinds of like line edits that he made in here. And also, I don't want to like steal the thunder from your book, but I was just so fascinated by the physical process of the original manuscripts mostly being lost, and so them having to kind of be retyped out and gone over like literally line by line, which on the one hand, that sounds like a nightmare. It also, I think to me, that sounds like such an interesting gift as a writer to get a chance to go in and engage with your own work again, line by line. And in your book, you show the way that Saunders looked at, sometimes revise a sentence, sometimes just a word or two in this way that sort of reflected his changing understanding of thematically what's going on in the work. I think that's fascinating. But to zero in on this work a bit, the main structure now of sort of like the Imaro you can go out and buy today is it begins with this boy, I believe he's 5 years old in the first section, in this version of Africa. Probably worth mentioning that while it is sort of an epic or fantasy version of it, and there are supernatural forces, there are monsters and demons and a variety of things in there, it's not like, it doesn't feel to me like a totally secondary in a way that some other fantasy does. He's not trying to like make a point that this isn't Earth, in that kind of fully secondary fantasy. Although he doesn't call places for the most part by their actual geographical current names, it does feel more like he's consciously trying to make an epic, mythic version of an actual continent. Maybe in some ways more like what Tolkien's doing with Middle-earth, right? Where it is secondary, but you can also kind of see, okay, I'm kind of basing this on a real place.
Yeah. And as I was reading Imaro, like I've got a map on the wall behind me here, so I would follow Imaro's adventures because he starts in, as you say, Northeast Africa. He's a Kahutu, Eliasai person. So he's from the Eliasai in Charles's world are the Maasai in our world. You can see parallels there. The Eliasai are herders with cattle, similar, except for the difference is if you've seen the pictures of them dancing that famous sort of leaping dance they do, Imaro is that height, but with a thicker stature. He's much bigger than the Maasai in our world or the Eliasai in his world, showing his contested parenthood, I guess, or his different parenthood. So he's kind of shown that in real life. And so he starts up there in Maasai territory in Kenya, Tanzania. And then as the novels progress, he comes all the way down to what's South Africa in our world, Nema, N-A-A-M-A in his world. And as you know, if you see Imaro encountering woods, there are woods in the world. If you see him encountering water, there is water. Mm-hmm. So how Charles did this in the 1970s and 80s, like for me, it was kind of easy to fact check him because I could just Google everything. Mm-hmm. But how Charles, with the resources available to him, and he also sought original real language. So Swahili is the main language root. So words like Yambo, they say for hello when he uses those words. But he specifically looked for like Xhosa words in South Africa, different words in West Africa. He always wanted the diversity of real Africa represented in his book and in the people too. The people you encounter, again, you can find them in the real world. Like he talks about one of Imaro's early encounters is with the Turkana people in his world, Turkana knives, and they have these wrist knives and they capture him and all these adventures unfold. And so I just Googled Turkana knives, and sure enough, I find a museum exhibit of exactly what Charles, and again, how he did that in the 1970s and 80s boggles the mind. But his Africa, his Nyumbani, that's his name, which is Swahili for home, is deeply rooted in our real world Africa. So his inventiveness always came on top of that real research in history.
Yeah, no, and it makes for an interesting experience reading it. Again, sort of like contrasting it with other people who are doing something similar, because it has that sense of connection all through it. It doesn't feel like, I mean, this is a style of literature that is in many ways very escapist, right? Like, I think of this sort of like pulpy adventure as like sort of quintessentially escapist in like the fun way. You're trying to get away, go to this fantasy land, have adventures. But it being sort of like grounded and connected to real places, and you're like noticing, I was looking up place names as I was reading this, or I was looking up words people say. I'm like, oh, this is clearly like lifted from an actual place. In this way that has this interesting mix of like always sort of keeping one foot in the real world. But Imaro is a big guy with a sword, and he goes around swinging it at stuff. That's never too far from the page.
And Charles once said he never gave too much consideration to the Freudian implications of Imaro's sword, or the fact that Imaro is more into punishment than reward. Although Charles, who had a psychology degree, clearly thought about those things. And can I talk a bit about the line edits, like those detections?
Yeah,
that was
absolutely.
One of the really interesting. And part of that was, like, this book, like usually it takes me a year or two to write a book, or I should say I take a year or two to write a book. This one is 5 years now, and it'll be 6 years all told. And that was so amazing because it gave me a chance to keep returning to these books. So I started reading the magazine versions of his stories published in the 70s. And eventually I bought a rather expensive Daw print, like the proof run Daw did. There was only apparently 6 in existence ever. Somehow somebody had one from a big Daw print, big Daw sale they got. So I got those and read that. Then I read the printed Daw version, and then the Nightshade, as you mentioned, in 2006, plus his Sword and Soul editions and the British one. And what I started to notice, because at first, there was the guidelines Charles tells us in the book that he pulled out the Slaves of the Giant King story because his Rwanda genocide became, too close to reality for him to continue using it. And that's all he told us he did. He did sort of mention that he improved his writing a little bit, and, that his younger self might have begrudged him that.
Mm-hmm.
But as I was reading it, so he wrote the first ones in his 30s for the most part, after his first divorce. He wrote the second ones, the rewrite, in his 50s after his second divorce. And the differences were fascinating. What I started to notice was, especially when Imaro is talking about Tanisha, basically anytime in the modern editions, if I read Imaro being nice or gentle or not just reaching for violence right away, I started to realize that was a clue that Charles had changed this. The first version of Imaro, his wife to be Tanisha glares at him. There's not much understanding. When they fight. She calls him a killer, and they just go their own ways. And in the modern ones, he replaces those things like calling him a killer with saying, I know how you suffered as a child. So Charles had clearly matured a lot in those 20 years, and he kind of went back and matured Imaro too. And I think that's what, with the Sword and Soul, the main sort of top of the page difference is that it's focused on black characters, or they don't have to be the main character, but they have to be front and center. It can be set in a black world, or it can be set with a black character in a non-black setting. But, the African roots, the black roots are critical. But I would say the psychological realism is important too. And I would say that's what makes Imaro different, especially like I've read Imaro, especially that first one, at least 5, 6, 7 times all the way through. I can't even, and I've gone over passages and passages. And you'd mentioned that opening of that 5-year-old boy standing in the rain. He's the son of no father. His mother is about to leave him, and he's set onto this course at 5 years old, sort of abandoned to these people who have contempt for him. And that level of sensitivity, because one of the things when I read that, I thought about it a lot. And I read a bunch of Conan stories. I read probably about 60, 70% of the Robert E. Howard's ones. And talking to some friends, I realized Conan never hugs a child, for example. In all of those adventures, all the things you can think of Conan getting up to, he never once hugs a child. He never once apologizes to a woman. These sort of differences that Charles, especially once he got to the third Imaro novel, Trail of Bohu, and could really plot things out on that grander scale that a novel allows you with greater finesse, where you don't have to do that roller coaster structure of a fix-up, but you can do kind of the airplane ride of a takeoff, go on a journey and land of a novel. And in doing that, and in the rewrites decades later, that's what he did, was he made Imaro more real, more human, more like us. And that, I think, makes his, I don't know, it connects us to his epic adventures in a different way, for me anyway.
One of the things that I really noticed reading just this first one, just Imaro in the Nightshade version this time, is that while on the one hand, yes, it is very episodic, so it is locked on that kind of roller coaster, and while the actual prose on the page has this, I don't know what to call it exactly. It has that sort of like pulp influence, sort of simplicity. Like it's a lot of action. It doesn't give a lot of direct introspection. You rarely get like an internal voice talking from someone. But I should say, it says the word thews a lot. If you haven't read this, you should know. He uses a fair amount of this sort of like semi-archaic language in this way I find kind of charming. But so it has that kind of like very surface, very action movie, kind of feel to it. But what I was noticing about this, thinking about this compared to Conan or something like that, is how much it has this sort of conflicted sense about itself and about the violence and about the emotion in this way that I found really interesting. The way that again, it doesn't have it almost never has internal dialogue. It almost never has sort of like what today we would call like therapy speak, but how much that Imaro knows that being an isolated child who was basically neglected and somewhat abused by the people who raised him, that's still with him. That's still with him when he's this towering, gigantic warrior. He still knows that that's part of who he is. And as Tanisha gets to know him more, his lover, like seeing that that's part of why he does the things he does, is just in it in a really interesting way. Again, like if I were reading this in a modern novel, I would expect him to like come to grips with that in this big, giant, cataclysmic way. But instead, it's just kind of there. And this fact that his loneliness was inflicted on him by others, and now he finds himself often choosing to be alone, even when he might not want to. It just adds this very subtle little tragic layer all through it that I found really interesting. And the last thing I'll say here, and ask you if you want to chime in on this, is I was really, really struck by the forthrightness of how often hate is in this book. This isn't like a sort of like carefree, sadistic, masculine guy running around trying stuff. It's very clearly motivated by anger and rage, often at his opponents, but then often at himself. Has these critical moments where he's thinking about his failures, who he was when he was younger. It has that, very, very kind of Freudian, Jungian bit where he has to literally fight himself and basically wins not by like accepting or forgiving who he was, but by turning all his anger towards himself as he was when he was younger. It's a very, again, it's not dwelled on very long on the page, but I just found that very rich and very poignant in a strange way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's how Charles did it, was he kept the action going, always action, always excitement, always adventure. But then what sticks with you after, like a week later, a month later, a year later, isn't necessarily the details of the battles, though he did those well, or the peculiarities of the monster of the day, although he did those well too, and you'll always benefit from digging into their cultural roots. But it's those moments in between. Like one thing I noticed in reading and rereading was, yeah, and you're right to say there's no joy in it. There's no, in Tarzan, he specifically says, my name is Whiteskin. That's what Tarzan means. And I love killing. Mm-hmm. Killing is great. It's fun. I do it just for kicks. Imaro, never. It takes something out of him, visibly, every time he kills someone, even though he kills a lot of people, especially once you get into the fourth and there's full-on war, it takes something out of him. And one thing I noticed was, if you are reading a scene where Imaro is exploding into violence, 9 times out of 10, if you go a page earlier, you'll find him bound. He's been captured, he's been tied up, he's been made like a child, basically. He's been reduced to weakness. And Imaro hates feeling weak, absolutely hates. That's the hate, the core of the hatred, I would say, is hating himself for being weak as a child, hating weakness at all. And so the violent explodes out of his captivity. It's him breaking out of literal chains and figurative chains too. And what I find, I think, you talked about like the therapy speak about it, because yeah, Imaro is a hunter-gatherer from hundreds of years ago. He has no access to anything like that. Nobody in his Iliasai tribe would even think to speak those ways. It's just get the job done and move forward. But that doesn't stop him from being plagued by doubts. Like he wonders, that is the insight you get. You're right, there's no inner monologue, But you do get him saying, somebody asks him once, who are you? You know, I need to know who you are. And he says, so do I. So that's what he's looking for. And what he's driving his adventure is not a desire to get revenge on anyone or to conquer a throne or to enhance himself. He wants answers. He wants to know who his father was and what happened to his mother and why he was left abandoned like that. And yeah, like you mentioned, like I mentioned Isakuku Medevu, that's the monster he is facing who takes the form of Imaro. And that's what he realizes in this really kind of thoughtful, in the midst of mayhem moment. Imaro thinks, why is my younger self, who's just a little smaller than me, a little less experienced, why is he beating me? And he realizes it's because he hates more. And so Imaro starts to see this balance that he has to strike. It's like if he embraces the hate inside him, he can be more powerful, more violent, more protecting of himself. But if he lets go of the hatred, he grows in other ways. He can connect to Tanisha, his wife, and Pomphus, his friend, and live a more peaceful life. So that's what he's trying to decide. Can he feel safe enough to put away the hate, or does he need to hold on to the hate? And I think that's where, especially to point out for the, I'm a white guy, a lot of his readers are young black men, especially young black American men. And I think this is one of the things that was kind of a bit opaque to me. It wasn't perfectly clear, but to young black American men, especially the ones I talked to for my book, that just hit right in the heart. That sense of rage, of hatred, of anger, of feeling like you have been put down and discounted and kicked to the side and told you're less than, and yet knowing the truth and fighting for it. I think that's what a lot of them immediately slide into. And you talked about escapism of fantasy. So Charles liked that too, like going into these worlds like Octavia Butler or Sam Delany and just going into their worlds. But for him, the problem was doing that in so much classic fantasy and science fiction, he would run into that racism, which, I think for me as a white reader, it's hard to replicate because there isn't really a parallel. Like the white people in Charles's Nyumbani aren't great people, but this isn't the first time I've encountered white people in fiction. Mm-hmm. So for black readers especially, I think that level of Imaro is vivid and vibrant and ultra compelling.
No, I think that's a great point. And one of these things about the book where on the surface level, this is just a pretty standard fantasy of this type convention, takes on this interesting angle. I was particularly thinking about Imaru's hatred of sorcery and hatred of, is it the Mchawi? Although, later as the books go on, we get more and more of a political world building, right? In a sense of like these different societies and kingdoms, some of which are at war with each other and like does have some ethnic division and things like that. For the most part, a lot of what motivates Imaro is just this anger towards dark sorcery and how he connects that to the things that have gone wrong in his life. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about that anger is that a lot of times in something similar, when Conan gets mad about something, and I'm, this is not all about Conan, but just as an example, it's sort of like in that scene, okay, this is this one person who is my opponent for this episode, and I'm mad at them. In Imaro, when he gets really, really mad, it's this sense of there's a power in that it's righteous, not just that he's angry, but that it can be sort of like pointed towards this very nebulous, unclear, like is it the old gods, the old masters? These demonic forces that are sort of reaching. We don't really know what they're all about for quite a while, and nor does Imaro, but that he's able to like pull on anger, pull on this very negative emotion, but in this way that is righteous and justified, and that's sort of like where his power comes from. And that's an unusual and I think very interesting sort of move emotionally. And thinking about being mad about social justice issues and not knowing what to do with that anger. I think that's part of what can make the fantasy work. And as I was reading this, I was thinking a lot about the kinds of secondary world fantasy that are being written today, and how much we just talked about N.K. Jemisin's the 5th season on the show not that long ago, and how much like anger at the world, like anger that things are the way they are, to the extent that like I'm willing to break it to fix it. And that's an interesting, like liberating, like cathartic thing to have in a fantasy. And it feels like it's tapping into a bit of that here.
Yeah, although I would say Imaro couldn't give two hoots if you survive or not. He couldn't care at all if the planet survives. He doesn't care about any of those bigger issues, which is kind of an interesting part of it. As you say, that dynamism that drives him is he's on this very personal quest for vengeance and understanding, but because of who he turns out to be, it's tied into everything else. And yeah, I think that nebulous force, that sorcery, the way Charles uses it, it is really fascinating, really interesting. And I think there's a lot to be studied from it. But my kind of first level insight is that I think a lot of it is racism. Because if you think about it, like, we talk about fantasy worlds. Well, how about you build a world where we just say that if you see this certain physical features of a person, you know right away that they're cowardly, that they're untrustworthy, that they're all these terrible, bad things, and they're probably going to die pretty soon. And you just knew it. Like, when you think, how would you get that into someone's head? How would you make them believe it so fervently that they would go to war over it, that they would harm other people out of this fantasy of racism? I think that underpins a lot of it. And that sense of, you talk about the nebulousness, because I think this is how someone like Charles would have experienced racism, is no one comes out and says, I'm going to be racist to you now. It just happens, and it happens in so many subtle, invisible, mysterious ways. And often maybe the person being racist isn't even quite aware that the reason they're not giving you the job is because you walked in and they went, oh, it's a tall black man, I'll be fair to him, and then somehow find reason. So all of this sort of sense of being thwarted in this, and I think that's what Charles was kind of, at least at the start, going with, is like this sense of how do you confront something like racism, which is like magic. It's like a dark, evil form of magic that has been planted in our minds and causes so much damage.
Yeah, no, totally. And I also think, like, I think there's something really interesting and really smart in the books, not just setting up fantasy racism and then vanquishing it, right? That, like, those are like motivating forces for how some of this works and for how it resonates. But I think that the sort of like ambiguity of how this works is part of what makes the novel work so well, at least for me.
Yeah, and I should probably add that there's not a lot of, like, the white people are kind of on for a little bit at the start, but are mostly kicked to the history books pretty soon in the novel, and the rest of it proceeds. I think probably if Charles started from scratch in his 50s, he would have left out that part altogether. I think he would have wanted to go more fully, but that was because his entry image was, as I say, watching Tarzan on TV and wanting to see a black hero burst out and kick Tarzan's ass. So the very first story he wrote, The City of Madness, guess what happens? Imaro jumps out of the bushes, and Pomphis, his friend who is a pygmy, a small person, kind of a child-sized person, is being tortured by three white people, the Mzungas, which is an African word meaning white skins or foreigners, something like that. And the very first order of business is Imaro jumps in, beheads them, stabs one in the stomach, and just murders the three of them, and then wipes his bloody sword off and looks at the little guy and says, Yambo, what's going on here, buddy? And so I think that was Child Charles having his revenge on Tarzan. And once he got that out of his system, I think he started to realize Imaro had a lot more to tell him, and it would take him decades to hear the whole story.
Do you have any other thoughts about about Imaro, the first novel?
I would say, yeah, it's one that rewards reading. I would say, especially if you're a white reader, it might take you a couple of goes through it, because the first time through, you'll just see the fun and the action and the adventure. But if you see it through Charles's eyes and slow down a little bit and pay attention to what sticks with you, because Charles was in my opinion, Charles was one of the greatest writers, full stop, and he chose to work in fantasy. He would have scorned the idea that fantasy was less than literature or literary writing. And specifically, especially for him, there was more encouragement to be a poet or write literature as a black person, especially as a black American. This was seen as, nobody really wanted him to write what he wanted, but he wanted to write that. So, try and read it through Charles's eyes, I would say.
I also just wanted to call out, before we sort of move on to the bigger picture, how much I really, really, really like the new story that he added to this to replace the story he excised, the Afua. So, like, realizing that he needs to rewrite a bunch of, like, character stuff that happened in the other story so that it works in later things. But it has such a mix of, like, it has this this effigy, this sort of, like, magic idol that, like, comes to life and stomps around. It has all of these, it introduces so many characters so quickly, and they're all this sort of, like, colorful, very, like, visually described kind of cast of characters. And then the one thing that really, and again, this sort of like shifted, there's nothing else quite like this in the other early stories, is the way it ends. So this story starts when Imaro has he's left his home culture because they've kind of like rejected and betrayed him. And even though they sort of like offer to welcome him back, he's sort of been scorned by them one too many times and he leaves. It begins with him coming into this new environment, coming into the forest, finding this new culture. He rescues these two fishers from a crocodile and gets welcomed into their culture. Lots of stuff happens. The very end of the narrative is one of the few places where the camera kind of goes away from Imaro and it goes back to that village that had taken him in, whose idol was stolen. And they have to they disperse, they move deeper into the jungle, they change over time. And it ends with them generations and generations later, their whole culture has changed. And they curse the name of the demon that had come among them and taken their good fortune away, a demon whose name was Imaro.
That's Charles, yeah.
Yeah, and it's so different from the rest of the book. And again, Imaro, the character, never knows this. And it's just this odd, melancholic sense. I think it really it both anchors it again in a real setting, and to me has that sense of the weird, tragic sadness that some of the pulpy kind of stuff has. And again, just this idea that you're this man of action, you're this godlike hero, but your actions have consequences and you don't even know all of them. It's this really strange note, and I really dug it.
Yeah, I love that story too. It was one of the first ones that I say really, at the time, the first time I read it, I didn't know it was a new one, but that image of this monster that comes to life, this statue that comes to life, and he has to stab it with one of the golden spikes to put it back into its, statue form. Yeah, it was so much fun. But yeah, as you say, that the camera angle, it's an interesting choice of words, because after Charles wrote the Daw versions in 1985, that's when they stopped, he switched and became a movie maker for about 5 years and made 2 movies, wrote and participated in them, and talked a lot about camera angles. So he really did think about camera angles a lot. And I suspect that by the time he got around to rewriting it, that was partially on his mind. I would say the other thing is with the Dossoye novels, who is his female warrior, kind of a Imaro in her own rights, that often happens in her short stories, which he wrote later, where she intervenes in some way. And yeah, often, I would say that's almost a hallmark of Charles, is you think you've got this nice ending, everything's wrapped up, and it's just oh shoot, we didn't roll the credits fast enough. And the story keeps playing out. And so often with Dossoye, she will leave thinking she's rectified the situation, but we stay behind and see just how it plays out. And I think it's saying a lot of things in some ways, because Imaro never has any grand plans for the world. He's not trying to reshape it in his image or anything. He just wants it to leave him alone, answer his questions and leave him alone. But he's kind of stuck with influencing our world. He is such a larger than life figure. He can't help but shake everything. All of his footsteps reverberate well beyond his actual path.
One of those other things that I think give these a sort of unexpected depth that's not immediately apparent is, the sort of existential nature of what Imaro's all about. For most of these, they have a sort of, they have a quest sort of in miniature, right? Where Imaro needs to find someone, he needs to avenge something, he needs to go get this thing. But in the larger picture, Imaro, why are you over here now? Why are you with these people? Why are you leading these bandits? It's just because he's kind of gone from thing to thing to thing to thing. And comparing that to most fantasy, which has these really tight notions of what the quest is, what the overall structure is, I don't find it a weakness. I actually find it kind of interesting that there are several points where, particularly I'm thinking of when he's sort of become the bandit king, and there's several points where the other people are what are we doing? I thought we were just bandits. What are we doing now?
Yeah.
And Imaro doesn't quite know either. He's sort of trying to follow and do what he thinks is right. He's trying to just kind of survive. But to me, it oddly enough has this sort of very modern sensibility that, you find yourselves dealing with the consequences of your actions and going to new places, having to start over, having to make new connections in this way that you don't see terribly often in this kind of fantasy. And even though it's there's no internal monologue, it's not called out in big flashing letters, to me that feels sort of a reflection on aging and on life and how your life takes turns you don't expect, rather than this sort of chosen one given narrative.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the kind of fantasy that there is one clear, definite purpose. And if we just march in all those steps, we will have accomplished it. One of my favorite scenes through the whole saga, through the whole 4 books are published. There's a 5th written, but not yet published, and a 6th collection of short stories beyond that. But of the 4 that are out there that I've read, is, I think it's in the fourth book, where Imaro at this point is not just leading the Haramia, the outlaw gang, but leading basically an actual army. And all kinds of stuff is happening. It's this huge, very high fantasy world now. Armies marching, great battle scenes. Charles is very good at great battle scenes. And Imaro kind of emerges from some bushes and sees a couple of boys tending a clump of cattle. And one of the kids immediately says, "I'll get help," and runs away as quickly as he can, understandably, because there's this, out of nowhere, these blood-covered monsters with swords, Imaro and his warriors. And the other one like stands his ground. He's like, he obviously doesn't have any chance if whatever Imaro and his friends want to do is going to happen, but he still stands there. And Imaro, you can almost see him change, and he's like, instead of having to do his job, basically, which is lead this war and do all this stuff, which you can see his heart's not really into it, because as soon as he sees the cattle, he's very interested. He walks over to them, he starts patting them behind the ear, he starts crooning to them. He's asking this boy, what do these ones like to eat? Oh, that's interesting. They like to, So he's truly interested in cattle throughout the series. Anytime you see an ox, a cow, a bull, Imaro is going to befriend it, is going to learn about the differences of that particular one. So you can see, I think that's part of what Charles does, is you can see in those moments that Imaro isn't all that wrapped up in Imaro. He doesn't really care that much about Imaro. And so it puts the pressure on us, kind of like, well, why do we need a hero like this? Why are we recruiting Imaro to try and do this thing? Why don't we just leave him alone to tend the cattle as he wants to do?
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. Let's take that for a quick break. I'm just going to grab a drink of water, and I will be right back. Still talking about Charles R. Saunders and his book Imaro and his legacy. I want to kind of switch over and talk a little bit more about your book. I always say I don't like to gas people up too much on the show, but I really, really, really enjoyed this book. Readers, check this out. I just found it was a really fascinating mix. I always love an author or artist biography that is able to integrate both their life and their work without leaning all the way either way. So I really enjoyed the way you looked at his practice of writing and what he actually wrote and the ideas that he was working on in his writing interplayed with his life and vice versa in this way that I found very illuminating. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed that. But one of the things I wanted to just kind of call out, and maybe to start us, is I just had this almost overwhelming feeling of tragedy about the timing of a lot of it as I was reading it. And people only write when they're writing, and they make the books they're making when they make them. That's part of the way the books are what they are. But this was so fascinating to me because, when I got sort of seriously into speculative fiction and fantasy, as a book reviewer, as, I was in a lot of book clubs, I went to science fiction conventions, things like that. That was already in the 2010s. I'd been reading science fiction since I was very young, but when I sort of became aware of the community was around then. And, I was a bookseller in Chicago for a while, and we could not keep Octavia Butler on the shelf. We couldn't keep, Toni Adeyemi's Blood and Bone books, all of these prominent Black fantasy and science fiction writers. There's really clearly an audience for them and a taste for them and people reading them and talking about them. And so to read about Saunders struggling just to get the books published and having a projected trilogy canceled on book 2, or a projected quadrilogy, canceled early, in the 80s and in the 90s, just was so tragic to me, especially as someone who, for all that his books are sort of still, I think, having a rebirth, and for all that, I would often see his name around because people would like to name check him because he has a lot of writers who really love him. That it took so long to sort of be rediscovered and get out there was just, I was just very, emotionally struck by it because it seems like the kind of things that if you're writing today, but of course he sort of blazed that path in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you're right. And I would say especially the Dossoye novels have an eerie modern feel to them. Yeah, very much Yeah, it's interesting to think about how different it was because back then Charles was working in a world where there was no black fantasy that he had ever read. Basically, like Sam Delany, he had read Sam Delany, but as he said, it wasn't exactly advertised back then. There are great black characters, but he didn't, it wasn't quite what he wanted to do. So there was nothing in front of him, and he created something to go in there. So it was and he wanted to create fantasy fiction. Like he was very specific that he was writing fantasy subgenre sword and sorcery subgenre sword and soul. Like he never wanted to see his sword and soul elevated above any of the other categories. He was a very like technical writer in that sense, a very big honest fan of it. And like Conan, he was, I would say, an uncomplicated fan of start to finish. He always said Robert Howard was the number one influence on his writing and his concept of Imaro, and you can see that in those episodic novels early on, that same structure. So he very much wanted to write pulpy, fun books that didn't draw attention to the issues they explored. I think he was almost trying to just mainstream it from the start, normalize it from the start, just put it in there, and just readers weren't ready for it. It was confusing in the way it was rolled out. And I think in some ways Charles would probably shoulder some of the blame himself in the sense that it was interesting to write this as a writer here in Nova Scotia myself, because after a while I was like, well, I wonder why he never tried to get his books published here, because there's lots of publishers in Atlantic Canada, and he was very well known for his nonfiction work. I talked to a few of them, and some of them said we just didn't publish speculative fiction at all, and that's probably true up until the 90s or so. But even still, and it was part of it was his division. Like he almost never tried to do anything fiction-wise in Canada. That was always in the United States. He seemed to have, I don't know, he very much siloed his life, and for whatever reasons, his fantasy career was going to happen in the US or not. And his nonfiction career was going to happen in Canada or not. And so he, in some ways he could have made life easier for himself, but that was the path he chose. And I think it shows you mentioned the tragic part, and of course there's no shortage of tragedy in Charles's life, especially his writing life. But for me as a writer, he was forced to ask that fundamental question, like, okay, you want to be a writer? Well, how bad? What if nobody wants to read you? What if it leads to disaster after disaster? What if it crushes you financially? What if nobody seems to care about your books at all? What are you going to do in your 60s? Are you going to accept that defeat? Or are you somehow in your 60s, which is what Charles did, going to rise up once more with worn out tools and rebuild it all again and better? And really in his 60s was when he stopped just Imaro. He realized, because when his books came back into print, so many people reached out to him over and over saying, I wanted to write black fantasy, and then I discovered you, and I wanted to do what you had done. Thank you, Charles. So he discovered that too, that he had all these fans. And so he created Dossuye, who has been around since the 70s as well, but his female warrior, and wrote 2 full novels for her specifically to broaden the base. And then he wrote Dhambala, which is a unique book for Charles. It's a kind of 1930s crime noir pulp fiction book. But again, sword and soul through and through, but it's the only one of his set in our world. And then other alternate Africa called Abangonee. And in this one, it was high fantasy, and the key concept he wanted to explore was, what if when black and white cultures met, they met as equals, and racism never started in the first place? And and he's doing this in his very late years, in his mid-60s, pushing on to 70. He's not ready to just, well, I gave it a good try, my books are out there. He was breaking new ground constantly. His last book was the part of a planned 4-part book. We only got part 1. But it's out there, and I think is an open challenge to readers to become writers and to create more of this world that he was so passionate about. So that's the question Charles had to answer. Are you a writer? And he answered, yeah. In the same way Imaro was a warrior, Charles was a writer. And it didn't matter if he was winning the battles, losing the battles, it doesn't matter. He was a writer, and so he would write.
I was really fascinated by your discovery in his life of these periods of having writer's block. But also at the same time, I was really fascinated by all the snippets of correspondence you included. And I was wondering, for me, like when I have writer's block, I have writer's block. Like I'm not responding to your email, but it seemed like he was someone who was able to keep up these conversations from afar, even if in his craft he might have felt blocked. And I was wondering what it was like for you to go through and sort of discover him through these correspondences, and what it was like to read his letters back and forth to people.
It was staggering. I mean, like at times I would have to like remind myself, like, this is Charles who you worked with, Charles who microwaved fish and annoyed everybody. It's Charles I'm talking about here. Because discovering, like, never would you guess that somebody you worked with for 2 years, 20 years ago, you would be reading this much about them. But just the way things unfolded, Charles didn't really have a lot of in-person friendships for most of his life. He preferred pen friendships. And he had up to 40 correspondents and at least 10 by the end of his life. And these weren't just like fan mail or, letter updates. These were deeply personal letters. I read about 250 letters Charles wrote. I read probably another 50 to 100 that people wrote to him from the 1970s right up till his death in 2020. And he really covered just about every aspect of his life. And, my kind of first thing was like, how much of this can I make public? Like, I am digging around in other people's basements and taking letters Charles sent decades ago. So one of the ways I got around that was I asked the people like Charles DeLint, like a lot of people will recognize that name, Charles DeLint, one of the greatest Canadian fantasy writers, Hall of Famer, legendary writer, also a great friend of Charles Saunders way back from the start, and a pen friend. So they wrote for decades about writing. So to read these two great writers, these passionate, and Charles DeLint is just as committed, just as passionate, just as active still, in his own way as Charles. And so to read them really unflinching, saying, this does not work. I was bored by this part. Or why don't you try, to see the hard work of writing, the gym hours the writer has to put in. It's not just about fight night, the book night. It's about the gym, the workouts you do. And then some of them were other people, so people he knew in Canada. One was a friend from Lincoln University. So I got to see all of these different parts of Charles and really almost miraculously felt like I would be guided to his words at times. Like I would wonder what Charles thought about a certain incident that I knew he must have witnessed. And sure enough, eventually, sometimes he wouldn't write about it. Like to his Lincoln friend, in 2018, he might write something about 1965. And as his biographer, like it was just an endless field of treasure. Everywhere I dug, there was more treasure there. So it was fascinating. And he wrote, I would say an autobiography for Franz. He wrote it, and I think he had it in his mind, because at one point he kind of relieved my worries a bit by saying, I know you keep most of your letters. That's what he said to Charles DeLint at one point. So I thought, okay, he knew, he was writing to people he knew kept their letters. So I think that was, in a way, Charles, he was probably too humble to think that somebody would be crazy enough to dig through all 250 of his letters, or 250 of his letters. But I think part of him thought, if they do go looking, I'll put something down.
Do you have a sense of, and I only know this from reading your book, but that, he had this period after Daw kind of, botched basically the publication of Imaro, setting themselves up for a lawsuit that delayed things, publishing the books at bad times that didn't get publicity they want, canceling it, halfway through. And he had this sort of like long period of not getting much published, right? And then this later sort of miraculous, astonishing revival and return to form. Do you have a sense in that intervening period from his letters, how close was Fiction in the Craft to his mind? Was he thinking about it the whole time? Did he kind of set it aside for a while?
The whole time. Thinking about it the whole time. He writes about Imaro, yes. So the whole 1990s, he didn't publish a single word of fiction, not one. It's funny because for us in Canada, we're like, oh, the 90s, we know where Charles was then. He was writing journalism. That's what we most know him from. But in that 18 years, he went 18 years without writing anything new about Imaro. And a year did not go by that he didn't think about Imaro and talk about him. I said he was like, almost like he talked about Imaro like a prodigal son, or Charles was the prodigal father who had squandered his chance to fully raise this person. So yeah, even when he was, a decade away from having written about Imaro, a decade away from returning to him, not planning, and several times saying, I think it's done, I'm not going back to Imaro, he still thought about him. And I think that's what really, especially in the modern editions, one of those things you detect without quite knowing it, is people say his worlds feel lived in. And that's because he didn't think of Nyumbani in January, write the novel over that year and publish it the next year. He spent close to 50 years in Nyumbani thinking about it, thinking constantly. And I'm sure he was thinking about the whole continent constantly, thinking about all of his characters. So even when he was as far away from fiction writing as he would ever get, he never stopped thinking about Imaro specifically, but I would say the whole Nyumbani world.
Huh, that's just really fascinating. I don't know, that's just wild to think about. Do you have any thoughts about how these sort of two halves of his writing life overlapped or affected each other? You know, I certainly, until I started doing some research for this episode, I didn't know that he had multiple nonfiction books.
Yeah.
You know, I knew about the screenplays, and listeners, if you are a fan of Roger Corman's Argentina period, look them up. If you're not a fan of Roger Corman's Argentina period, probably not for you.
Amazons with an exclamation mark, 1986, that's the search terms, and then Stormquest.
In the lost world of Kimbia, the brutal Storm Queen rules an empire of deadly Amazon fighters and helpless male slaves. But even in this forgotten land, there are rebels. And now the brothers and sisters of Kimbia must join together to fight or die. It's a journey into primeval adventure that will blow you away. Storm Quest.
Amazons is kind of fascinating because that was Dossuye, his black warrior, and her black war bull. But the producers were kind of like, love it, Charles. Can we make everybody white? And he was like, okay, if I do this and can prove I can do this, maybe. But yeah, his nonfiction books and how they influenced it. Yeah, again, one of the things that struck me very early on was every American I talked to, if they knew Charles, it was his fiction, no clue about his journalism. Canadians, exact opposite. And yeah, I think it really did have a profound impact. And I think it's telling that his worlds created before he came to Nova Scotia, Africadia, the black cultural region I'm in. Nyumbani, as I say, there's hardly any white people in it, and most of them are bad guys. They're all bad guys, and most of them are just
kind of bit players. Yeah, right.
But that's when he came up with the idea for Abangonee, a world where whites and blacks met as equals and got along in Nova Scotia. Now, I'm not saying Nova Scotia is a fantasy world without racism. Charles and anyone else who moves here will quickly learn that's not the case. But I think we do have a different history. And like our history here in Nova Scotia, as Charles would have learned, goes back to 1604 when Matthew da Costa, an African man from today's Ghana, came here with Samuel de Champlain to meet Membertou, the Mi'kmaq leader. And so our oldest image of cultures meeting is cultures meeting as equals. Europeans, Africans, indigenous people, the Order of Good Cheer, they did in the real world here, met as friends, as traders, as allies. And I think that seed planted deep in Charles's mind, and he thought, what would it be like had that beginning not been wrecked by racism as it was, had that not had slavery later introduced? There was slavery here in Nova Scotia. There was and is racism. What if that had not happened? What if we had kept to that original vision? So I think it had that influence. And the other big one, as people who, if they read To Leave a War Behind, will really, I think, enjoy, is Tanisha, Imaro's love interest. She is completely changed in a way that didn't need to be. He needed to fix the books so that he could get rid of the Rwanda story without sacrificing the plot. But Tanisha didn't need to be changed as a person, and yet she was, because Charles had married a woman here, an African Nova Scotian woman here. And I think the reality of her and the reality of Charles's encounterings with the Black community here, he had a book launch at the Black Cultural Center, which is, sacred ground here in Nova Scotia. He was very, very involved and wrote a profound essay on Africville, so profound that most people, myself included, thought Charles was from Africville until he said, "Hey, John." They're like, "Oh, that accent is not an Africville accent." So I think it rooted his writing in reality like never before. So when he returned to it, I like the word escape, which is a Latin root that means ex capa, like you escape from somebody so narrowly they're holding your cape, but you got away. And so Charles realized he didn't want to escape anymore. He wanted to turn and fight what he was dealing with. And so I think that's what you see in his great revival in the 2010s, all those books in his 60s, it's Charles, born in Pennsylvania, raised in America, and now sort of nourished in Canada for several decades. And all of that pulled together into this great explosion of creativity in his last decade of life.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. That's really great. Thanks so much for coming on and talking about this book. Your book is called
To Leave a Warrior Behind.
It should be out now. before we go, do you have anything else you want to share about where people can find you or anything else you're working on?
Well, I'll just share one thing. I'm not a particularly online kind of guy, but for the book, I almost would recommend the audiobook to try that out. Just this week, I finished myself recording it. I only learned a month ago that there was going to be an audiobook. I had to audition for it. I got the job. But for me to be in that booth, so I was in that recording studio for about 30 hours to record a 10 or 11 hour book. And I had the picture of Charles that you can see behind me. I had that in front of me. So I spoke the whole book to him. And it was it was very cathartic for me. It was very, it felt like the completion of this book. I never felt like I'd really fully 100% completed a book before, but this one, especially the audiobook version. So if you want to hear that, and Imaro lends himself well to told stories, that very much that old around the campfire. So yeah, pull up your campfire and get the audiobook and tune into the extraordinary inner worlds of Charles R. Saunders.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this. And knock on wood, I'm really hoping to get to Halifax one of these days. So we'll see.
Awesome. Look me up. I'll give you the guided tour.
Amal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartra Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, congrats! You may be good. A few different ways you can do that. You can join our Patreon. Throw us a couple bucks a month to keep the podcast and the magazine sustainable. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a few other perks on the way. If you're interested in a book we mentioned on the podcast, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut. It helps immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, elaborate compliments, drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky for however long that stays cool, and probably slightly past that. We were so excited talking about Imaro and To Leave a Warrior Behind that we actually didn't talk at all about Jon's work as a writing and publishing coach. Check out his website if you'd like to know more about that. Coming up next time, every morning he fires up the graphing calculator and asks, what if science fiction was good? It's a Greg Egan episode with friend of the pod, Eden Coopermans, returning to talk about the far future, reality hopping, big and small picture diaspora. Gonna be good. Until then, thanks for listening, and as always, stay critical out there.